Here, watch the video.
Marcus graduated, and it was a shock. I mean, because I never dreamed in a million years that he would finish his race when he did, but he did. And he had left instructions that in the event of his homegoing, you know, that I would run Daystar, but I never really thought that would happen because I already do so much at Daystar. You know that. I'm over the music and production and do Joni Table Talk and co-hosted with him on Ministry Now. So it was a lot of responsibility, but you know what? I think that as I look back, I can see how, you know, God was preparing me all these years. And even though I never thought I would be in this position, when he passed, I knew that I needed to keep getting up every morning and continue to do what God had called me to do. And I talk about in the book that, yeah, it was the greatest storm I ever went through because, Lance, you can't imagine, you love your beautiful wife, but you can't imagine losing a spouse because it's like half of your heart goes. I mean, literally, it's like your heart is cut in two and you only have half a heart and you think, can God heal that? Can he put it back together? But actually getting up every day and continuing to do the shows, continuing to lead at Daystar, I think was part of the healing process for me. And it doesn't really make sense in the natural, but actually when you give out in the middle of pain or grief or sorrow, that what comes back is joy and love and just the ability to get up every day.
This video explores Joni Lamb's transition into leadership at Daystar, a Christian television network, following the death of her husband and co-founder, Marcus Lamb. It highlights her personal journey of overcoming grief and stepping into the CEO role, a position she initially didn't anticipate. However, the sources also discuss significant challenges to her leadership, particularly concerning unresolved accusations of misconduct involving a family associate and discrepancies in the succession plan Marcus Lamb outlined for his son, Jonathan. The video emphasizes the tension between Joni's inspiring personal narrative and the calls for greater transparency and accountability within Daystar's governance. Finally, it proposes concrete steps the ministry can take, such as independent audits and public policy disclosures, to restore trust and uphold its stated values of integrity. Now to join our upcoming conversation, kindly subscribe to this channel.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at, well, a collection of sources that really get into a story of profound personal loss, but it's intertwined with, leading a major ministry. We're focusing on Joni Lamb of Daystar, specifically that time right after her husband, Marcus Lamb, passed away.
Right. And these sources, they cover a lot of ground, her personal journey through grief, the transition.
Yeah, exactly. But they also bring up some pretty significant questions, don't they, about transparency and governance within Daystar itself.
They certainly do.
So our goal here in this deep dive is really to navigate those layers. We want to understand the powerful story of resilience, but also these calls for more accountability that are present in the material.
Makes sense. It's a complex picture.
It really is. Let's maybe start with the personal side. The sources definitely highlight just how deep Joni Lamb's experience was after losing Marcus. It wasn't just sadness. The pain described sounds almost unbearable.
Oh, absolutely. The language used in the sources is incredibly vivid. Things like her heart being cut in two, feeling half gone, half empty.
Wow.
Yeah, they really paint this picture of grief coming in waves so deep that, well, according to these accounts, there were times she literally couldn't breathe.
Just couldn't catch her breath.
Exactly. It was, and she's quoted in the sources here, the greatest storm I ever went through.
And you can imagine just facing the day in that kind of storm. Waking up must have felt pointless sometimes with memories just everywhere.
That's precisely what the material gets across. Simple, everyday things became huge challenges. But even in that really raw period, that first season of widowhood, the sources do note she started feeling these, well, fragile stirrings of hope.
Okay.
There were moments where it seems like sheer will just pushed her towards the morning light. The accounts suggest she learned grief wasn't like a solid wall blocking everything, but more like this relentless river, one that could actually carve out new channels of strength over time.
That's a powerful image. So out of this immense pain, the sources seem to suggest she found a kind of renewed purpose. There are mentions that Marcus had told her, run Daystar if I'm gone, but it sounds like she hadn't really processed that or expected it to happen so soon.
Right, exactly. Stepping fully into the CEO role wasn't something she'd really envisioned, according to the material. It indicates that before he passed, I mean, she had significant roles overseeing music, production, co-hosting shows like Ministry Now, leading Joni Table Talk.
So she was deeply involved already.
Deeply involved, yes, but the top leadership spot,
Yeah.
that wasn't her primary focus based on these accounts.
What seems really interesting, though, from the sources is how her grief almost seemed to demand action from her. Like she had to rise each morning, not just for herself, but thinking about the thousands tuning in, depending on the ministry.
And what's particularly striking, I think, from these accounts is how the broadcast studio is described almost as a sanctuary for her. Yeah. The act of pouring into the viewers, serving them, it seemed to pour life and healing back into her own spirit. It wasn't just a job anymore. As presented in the sources, it really became a pathway to healing through service.
And looking back, the sources say she kind of saw how earlier challenges, those late night edits, doing live broadcasts, producing music, even debating complex topics, they were almost like unexpected training, preparing her for this moment.
Yes, exactly. Turning personal tragedy into a platform for purpose is a really key theme here. The sources framed this part of her story as showing how suffering can forge our greatest strengths. Leaning into that calling became, well, a vital lifeline for her during that time, according to these accounts.
Okay, but then woven through this really powerful personal story in the sources, there are also these details about significant organizational questions, things that led to what the material calls relentless scrutiny on her leadership.
Right. And this is where the material brings in a different perspective. While her personal story is undeniably compelling, critics, according to these sources, point to unresolved issues. Issues they argue expose, well, underlying deception within the ministry.
Okay, like what specifically?
One specific area mentioned is an unresolved investigation concerning someone the sources refer to as Pete. He's described as a family associate, and it involves what the sources label as SA allegations.
Okay, SA allegations. And there's also the succession issue, which sounds complex. The sources detail that Marcus's written instructions had apparently named their son Jonathan as the successor.
That's what the sources state, yes. Yet they also state that the Daystar board ultimately endorsed Joni for the leadership role, and Jonathan himself, well, he's no longer with Daystar.
So critics, as presented in the material, are questioning how a ministry that, emphasizes transparency can operate seemingly unchecked when a core decision like succession appears, at least according to these accounts, to go against the founder's own stated wishes.
Precisely. And a former Daystar insider, Dennis Boggs, he's highlighted in the sources as someone pointing directly at that apparent contradiction, the difference between Marcus's documented will and what the board actually did. And the sources also mention other allegations brought by Jonathan and Susie Lamb concerning their daughter again, referred to in the sources as SA allegations.
And those remain unresolved publicly.
That's what the material indicates. While Daystar stated it was investigated internally and closed, the sources note that, well, no independent audit results or clarification from law enforcement has actually been released to the audience, according to these accounts.
So instead of directly addressing these specific questions, the sources suggest Joni has leaned more heavily on her personal testimony. Her story of overcoming grief, urging supporters to trust her, and her sense of calling.
Yes, and that tension right there between the powerful, faith-affirming personal story and the demands for concrete, institutional accountability that's presented in the sources as the defining challenge of her leadership period. Her personal story clearly resonates with many, but these unresolved questions, according to the sources, seem to undermine broader confidence.
Okay, so given this picture from the sources, what does it suggest about the path forward? Does the material offer any potential steps Daystar could take towards maybe restoration and greater trust?
It does, actually. Looking at the broader implications presented, the sources lay out 4 specific measures they suggest are necessary. First, they propose commissioning a truly independent audit.
Okay, independent being key.
Absolutely. An audit that would look into the SA investigation involving Pete, the board's succession decision-making process, and just general governance practices. The principle here, as highlighted, is bringing in an unbiased eye for objective scrutiny, and then, crucially, releasing those findings publicly.
Right, transparency. What's the second step?
Second, they suggest publishing internal policies and procedures. This means things like how sensitive allegations are handled, how leadership transitions are managed, how internal conflicts get resolved, make those processes clear and accessible.
So everyone knows the rules of the game, so to speak.
Exactly. Setting clear expectations and standards up front. That's what the sources argue this step is about.
Okay. And third?
Third, fostering open dialogue. This could involve moderated forums, maybe online, maybe in person, allowing stakeholders, potentially including Jonathan and Susie Lamb if they chose to participate, to ask questions and get candid answers.
With neutral facilitators, you mentioned.
Yes, the emphasis is on having neutral facilitators to keep the conversation productive. The sources frame this as a way to bridge those communication gaps directly.
Makes sense. And the fourth suggestion?
And fourth, the sources propose a foundational review of Marcus's original succession plan, working together with the current board. It's about revisiting his documented intentions and really evaluating how Jonathan's role as the initially named successor might be honored or perhaps redefined moving forward.
So it sounds like the core idea here presented in the sources is that taking these steps moves Daystar beyond just relying on Joni's compelling personal story for its legitimacy.
That's right. It would represent more of an embrace of collective accountability. It reframes her leadership not just as this heavy burden she took on in grief, which it undoubtedly was, but as a shared responsibility for building trust and transparency within the institution itself.
And the sources really seem to emphasize that the power of any ministry's message is just intrinsically linked to the integrity of the messenger and the organization behind them.
Oh, definitely. For a ministry that preaches honesty and faith, there's naturally heightened scrutiny on whether its internal practices actually line up with those public values.
So things like publishing details about Marcus's succession instructions, or giving clarity on Jonathan's departure, or transparently resolving that investigation concerning Pete. The sources suggest this goes beyond just legal boxes to tick.
Far beyond, according to the material. It argues that taking these steps would actively model the very values the ministry promotes. You know, concepts like vulnerability, confession where it's needed, restoration, and accountability to the community they serve.
It sounds like the suggestion is when leaders are willing to invite that scrutiny and openly address the difficult stuff, their public witness becomes much more authentic and credible.
Precisely. And conversely, the sources warn that failing to act transparently risks repeating a pattern we've unfortunately seen elsewhere in some faith-based media organizations, where charismatic leadership eventually gets undermined by, well, opaque governance practices. And in an era where audiences, increasingly demand both inspiring stories and concrete evidence of ethical operation, the sources state pretty clearly that Daystar's future impact really hinges on successfully balancing those two critical elements.
Joni Lamb's story, as we've seen it presented in the sources, it powerfully shows how personal pain can fuel purpose. That's undeniable. But the material seems to conclude that lasting impact and trust really come when that purpose is married to transparent principle and practice.
And for you, the listener, the sources suggest the takeaway is pretty clear. You can absolutely continue to be inspired by the message of hope offered, but you can also do that as an informed partner, meaning the material encourages asking for the facts, seeking transparency, and holding leaders, really, in any organization, not just this one, to high standards of accountability.
So as we wrap up this deep dive then, we've really navigated through a complex picture presented in these sources. On one hand, this story of incredible personal strength, faith forged in grief.
A really compelling narrative.
And running right alongside it, these pressing questions about governance, about transparency within a large ministry. It really highlights that tension, doesn't it, between the personal story and the institutional need for accountability.
It absolutely does. And maybe this leaves you with a final thought to consider. In any organization, but especially those built on public trust and support, how can that personal inspiration and the institutional integrity not just coexist, but actually strengthen each other?
That's a great question. What does it mean for you as someone engaged in any community or audience to look for not just the inspiring stories we all connect with, but also the evidence of principle and transparent practice behind the scenes?